We're in session 10 of the book of Deuteronomy. Okay, well, we're in Deuteronomy chapter 21. We're going to talk about what do you do with unsolved murders. We'll talk about captive war brides, and we'll also talk about rebellious sons as well as a few other topics. So this is Moses giving it. It's really a sermon by Moses, but it recaps many of the highlights, not all, but many of the highlights of the law itself, as has been enumerated in Exodus and Numbers and so on, and Leviticus. So Deuteronomy 21, verse 1. If one be found slain in the land, which the Lord thy God giveth thee to possess it, lying in the field, and it be not known who hath slain him, then thy elders and thy judges shall come forth, and they shall measure unto the cities which are round about him that is slain. And it shall be that the city which is next unto the slain man, even the elders of that city, shall take a heifer which hath not been wrought with, and which hath not drawn in the yoke. And the elders of that city shall bring down the heifer unto the rough valley, which is neither eared nor sown, and shall strike off the heifer's neck there in the valley. It's going to be sacrificed. Now it's interesting that the elders and the priests, if you will, were to sacrifice this heifer. Strange thing. Part of it's to declare. This is an attempt. It's a procedure to declare their own innocence, in effect. And since the animal was slain in the field and not at the altar, this is not a cultic ritual like in Leviticus. This is part of a judicial proceeding, strangely enough. And the priests of the sons of Levi shall come near. For them the Lord thy God hath chosen to minister unto him and to bless in the name of the Lord, and by their word shall every controversy and every stroke be tried. So you understand that the priests were really the judicial instrument here. It's this whole idea of breaking the heifer's neck and so forth symbolized that the crime deserves capital punishment, and it also the washing of the elders' hands over the heifer symbolizes that their innocence of the matter. So this is what's interesting here is there's an implied accountability of the region for this murder. The fact that it happened, the town that's nearest by, in some respects, has a responsibility here. That's really what this is all intended to convey, and the seriousness of it by the slaughter, if you will, of this heifer. And all the elders of that city that are next unto the slain man shall wash their hands over the heifer that is beheaded in the valley. So they're symbolizing, they're declaring their innocence there. It's interesting, as I read this, I can't help but remember another man that washed his hands before Christ being crucified. But they shall answer and say, our hands have not shed this blood, neither have our eyes seen it. Be merciful, O Lord, unto thy people Israel, whom thou hast redeemed, and lay not innocent blood unto thy people of Israel's charge, and the blood shall be forgiven them. You know what's interesting about this? It seems to imply that if they don't do that, they're going to be held accountable. Doesn't really say that. It implies it. It's an argument from silence, so to speak. But it's a ritual, of course, that indicates to God how precious life is in the first place. So even though no murder is found, and the land and the people are regarded as being guilty of the blood, of shedding innocent blood. And so the idea is that if they don't find this guy, this is intended to be, at least in some sense, an atonement for that, to turn God's wrath away. That implies if they don't do this, God's wrath will be upon them. And it's strange how the whole concept of the shedding of blood is tied to the land. Remember when the first murder occurs? When Cain kills Abel, that God says that his blood cries from the ground to God. And it could be just poetic language on the one hand, or it could be something but far more profound going on here. But anyway, let's go on here. Verse 8, be merciful, O Lord, unto thy people Israel, whom thou hast redeemed, and lay not innocent blood unto thy people of Israel's charge, and the blood shall be forgiven them. So shalt thou put away the guilt of innocent blood from among you, when thou shalt do that which is right in the sight of the Lord. So we have this, and it's interesting as we try to examine our own culture, that we have had an aversion to capital punishment on the one hand, At the same time, we have some really serious problems with violence. And I'm not trying to be sophisticated enough to link that all up, but I think that we need to, examine carefully the Word of God and recognize that while on the one hand we don't have these tribal procedures, on the other hand we aren't really following God's instructions relative to capital crime on the other. So it's an issue. But Deuteronomy continues, when thou goest forth to war against thine enemies, and the Lord thy God hath delivered them into thine hands, and thou hast taken them captive. So that now he's shifting the subject here. We're talking about a successful prosecution of a war effort. It says, and seest among the captives a beautiful woman, and hast a desire unto her that thou wouldest have her to thy wife, then thou shalt bring her home to thine house, and she shall shave her head and pare her nails and go on. We're getting into, from verse 10 on, to the family laws, all kinds of family issues here. And this idea of marrying a captive woman, see, an Israelite was permitted to marry a beautiful woman from the captives of a particular battle. That was part of the spoils in a sense. But and this assumes that the battle was against cities at a distance, in other words, distinguished from the Canaanites. It was not a Canaanite situation; they were to slaughter those. And so this is in effect not a city within the borders of what commonly is called Palestine. And so the wife would not be a Canaanite woman. There's a prohibition expressed against the Canaanite woman back in chapter 7, if you recall. So, but if an Israelite soldier genuinely desired one of these captives, he could have her only through marriage, not just taking her, only through marriage. And this was intended to help protect the dignity of the woman captives and the purity of the Israelite soldiers. So if they're going to do that, there was a procedure here laid out. And they were not to rape or plunder or otherwise mistreat captives, as was typical of the other armies of other nations. Not just then, even in modern times, but that's what is being, in effect, argued against here. But anyway, she'll be shaven, so she'll put on raiment of her captivity from off of her. She shall remain in thine house and bewail her father and mother a full month. She has a month of mourning here, because she'll be taken away from that culture from which she came, and so on. So she has a month to mourn that. After that, thou shalt go in unto her and be her husband, and she shall be thy wife. So that's pretty straightforward. And this would, so it didn't, if he's going to do this, it can't take place immediately. There's a month here where she can mourn, but it's also a month when he can reconsider. And so it gives his wife a chance to be psychologically prepared for what's coming, and also to prepare herself for a whole new life as an Israelite, if you will. And so the whole idea of shaving her head, trimming her nails, changing clothes, mourning for her parents was a month of, if you will, preparation. And so this sort of implies that it could very well be that her mother and father were killed in the battle, but that's not necessarily the only aspect here. And and if it shall be, if it shall be that if thou have no delight in her, then thou shalt let her go whither she will. But thou shalt not sell her at all for money, and thou shalt not make merchandise of her, because thou hast humbled her. So if he chooses to let her go, that's a whole other thing. And if a man have two wives, one beloved and one hated, and they have borne him children, both the beloved and the hated, and the firstborn son be hers that was hated, then it shall be when he maketh his sons to inherit that which he hath, that he may not make the son of the beloved firstborn before the son of the hated. Excuse me. Let me read that. I might read that carefully. That he may not make the son of the beloved firstborn before the son of the hated, which is indeed the firstborn. In other words, the right of the firstborn is a very, very critical thing in their culture. It didn't apply to a concubine situation. That was one of the differences between a wife and a concubine. A concubine was not a prostitute. It's a sort of a second level relationship, second to the wife, but not. It was a formalized relationship, strangely enough. But here in this case, we're talking here where he has two wives, both wives now, one beloved, one hated. It's very interesting how that always seems to be a pattern. It's interesting. The Scripture, monogamy has always been the divine ideal for marriage in the Old Testament, and the polygamy never appears in a positive light in the Scripture. And it never describes a truly happy polygamous marriage. what is dealing with here is that one wife will always be loved more than the others, and so that what is this is forbidding the husband to favor the son of the one he loves the most. He's required to observe the issue of the firstborn. The firstborn got the double portion. Whatever the others inherited, the firstborn got twice as much. That was the way it worked. And it's interesting how in the book of Genesis, God underscores the rights of the firstborn. As you go through the book of Genesis, there's several occasions there where the rights of the firstborn were violated, and yet there are cases where God will reach around the formal firstborn to get the one that he chooses. So God's sovereignty and grace always prevails. But in any case, that was not man's prerogative. He was to acknowledge the firstborn. And by the way, so you understand something, there's a lot of confusion that occurs about this term firstborn. Yes, he was firstborn, but that's not what the word really means. It means of preeminence. And Jesus Christ was considered firstborn of creation. And does that mean there's a secondborn? No. It means that it's a term that implies a preeminent position. And we need to understand that. The whole concept of firstborn is an important thing to do some background. But let's move on. But he shall acknowledge the son of the hated for the firstborn by giving him a double portion of all that he hath. For he is the beginning of his strength. The right of the firstborn is his. So that's a prohibition. Now we talk about rebellious sons. None of us wouldn't have any experience with that, I suspect. But they had a way of dealing with rebellion among kids in Israel. If a man have a stubborn and rebellious son, which will not obey the voice of his father or the voice of his mother, and that when they have chastened him will not hearken unto them, then his father and his mother shall lay hold of him and bring him out unto the elders of the city and unto the gate of his place. Oh boy, what's coming? And they shall say unto the elders of his city, this our son is stubborn and rebellious, and he will not obey our voice, for he is a glutton and a drunkard. And all the men of the city shall do what? Stone him with stones, that he die. So shalt thou put evil away from among you, and all Israel shall hear and fear. Now I suspect that if we enforce this, we'd have a lot of rock piles. But they and obviously are dealing with a judicial situation here, not just some casual rebellion. They're dealing with a very serious situation. But they made the subjection of the son to the parents a capital crime. I mean, a capital issue, a capital issue. And I'm not proposing any changes in our practice, but I find that provocative. But it goes on to something else here. And if a man have committed a sin worthy of death, and he be put to death, and thou hang him on a tree, his body shall not remain all night upon the tree, but thou shalt in any wise bury him that day. For he that is hanged is accursed of God, that thy land be not defiled, which the Lord thy God giveth thee for an inheritance. You know, this is a very, very strange passage, the more you study it. Because hanging, or crucifixion even, was not the form of capital punishment in Israel. The form of capital punishment in Israel was stoning. And what really is astonishing when you start to put it together is the description in the Old Testament, particularly in Psalm 22, of Christ's crucifixion. Because that was penned 700 years before the idea of crucifixion was invented. It was invented by the Persians and, of course, widely adopted by the Romans. In the book of Esther, when you hear about Haman and the gallows, that's a mistranslation. It wasn't hanging that Haman was after, it was crucifixion. He was being impaled, not hung. But of course, the Persians get followed by the Greeks, and it's the Romans that really adopt that as their primary form of capital punishment. But the point is, all that's centuries later. This is back in the days of Moses. No, the form of capital punishment in Israel was stoning. Now, apparently, when it was something particularly heinous and they wanted to make an example of him, after he had been stoned, they took his body and hung him on a tree. And what this is saying is you don't leave him on there overnight. They didn't want the land littered with these examples hanging from trees. The intent was that people would see it and it would be a deterrent, what have you. He shall not remain all night upon the tree, but thou shalt anyways bury him that day. For he that is hanged is accursed of God. Now this is a very subtle one, but I wanted to highlight this because this is what I would call, as an information specialist, a macro code. This is an anticipatory code. He that is hanged is accursed of God. But that's strange because they're saying don't do that. Because he that's hanging, well, why is it saying this? Well, because Paul will clarify this in Galatians. In Galatians 3:13, Paul says, Christ hath redeemed us from the curse of the law, being made a curse for us. For it is written, cursed is everyone that hangeth on a tree. So the whole idea of Christ being crucified is an echo, if you will, of this concept that hanging on the tree is a sign of the curse. That was given back here in Deuteronomy, and yet it's an anticipatory remark that has implications for you and I, not because of the bodies that might be hanging back there, but because it points to the cross. That's what a macro code is, a term in the computing industry used for an anticipatory code. Those of you that use word processors know what you use what they call a macro. You can construct codes that when you have a repetitive thing, something that you're going to do a lot of, you can code it so it'll do it with just one keystroke, so to speak. If you're going to send a fax, you can hit one stroke and it'll set up the fax that's coming. If you're going to send an email, you can hit it and set up it differently. It's a code that anticipates what's coming to format it properly, what have you. What are other macro code examples? Well, I'll give you another one. That's the brazen serpent. Remember Numbers 21, when these serpents were killing off Israel because of a curse God sent. Moses prays, and God says, okay, everyone make a brass serpent, put it on a pole on top of the tree, on the top of the hill. Everyone that looks at it will be spared the death from the serpents. Pretty weird idea when you stop and think about it. What's that got to do with anything? Here's a serpent as a symbol of sin, and here's a brass serpent on a pole. What's that got to do with anything? Well, the brazen serpent is, of course, it doesn't make sense until you get to John 3 when Jesus explains it. Because as Moses raised the serpent in the wilderness, so shall the Son of Man be raised up. So suddenly you realize that the brass serpent is sin judged, and that's on a pole. Back in Numbers 21 is a clue that it's coming on the cross. So it's an example of a macro code. Bread and wine. It's introduced by Melchizedek in Genesis 14. When Abraham goes to Melchizedek, Melchizedek administers bread and wine. And Joseph interprets dreams in Genesis 40. Remember the wine steward and the baker and so forth, and so on. And that is all anticipatory echo, if you will, of the Lord's Supper and so on. And the ultimate one is the Akedah, when Abraham offers Isaac. On the very spot that he does that, another father will offer his son as an offering for sin. At Golgotha. The book of Ruth, the role of Goel, is an anticipatory description of our kinsman redeemer, Jesus Christ. The feasts of Moses, the 7 feasts in the Torah, are each one anticipatory of Christ. The first 3 of his first coming, the last 3 of his second coming, and this peculiar one between them that has that strangely leavened bread as its emphasis and so on. And Jesus, of course, explains this. The volume of the book is written of me. It says that in Psalm 40, verse 7, and it's quoted in Hebrews 10:7, and so on. Okay, so we got through that chapter pretty quickly. Let's go to Deuteronomy 22. Let's have some more issues about domestic and personal relations. In Deuteronomy 22, verse 1, thou shalt not see thy brother's ox or his sheep go astray, and hide thyself from them. Thou shalt in any case bring them again unto thy brother. You know, this law about lost livestock is really intended to demonstrate a principle, to love thy neighbor as thyself. What he's saying, you can't ignore his need. You can't just shrug it off, his problem, he's lost his sheep or something. No, you have an obligation to treat him as you would have, as you would be treated yourself. So this is not just talking about just returning a lost item. It's an argument against the natural tendency to ignore it because of the extra time and labor that's involved and so forth. Because as you'll see here in the next verse, if the guy's a long way away, you have an obligation to deal with that distance You have to, take it take it and deal with it. If thy brother be not nigh unto thee, near you, or if thou know him not, then thou shalt bring it into thine own house, and it shall be with thee until thy brother seek after it, and thou shalt restore it to him again. In like manner shalt thou do with his ass, and so shalt thou do with his raiment, and with all lost thing of thy brother's which he hath lost, and thou hast found, shalt thou do likewise. Thou mayest not hide thyself. Thou shalt not see thy brother's ass or his ox fall down by the way, and hide thyself from them. Thou shalt surely help him to lift them up again. So it's the whole idea, whether it's a lost cloak or whatever it is, that the idea is you should not be tempted to stay uninvolved with somebody else's needs. You have an obligation to deal with your brother's needs. And so the woman shall not wear that which pertaineth to... Oh, no, here's a whole other subject. The woman shall not wear that which pertaineth unto a man. If any of your girls are wearing slacks, I apologize. Anyway, neither shall a man put on a woman's garment. For all that do so are abomination unto the Lord thy God. So this is a transvestite issue. And all of this is forbidden because it obscures the distinction that God has ordained between the sexes. And that you're violating an essential order of life. This comes up in many, many forms. I had some questions in the break, this whole business of ordaining women as pastors, because Paul talks about that. And a lot of people, have a lot of difficulty with that. And of course, it also, especially in our day, the prominence and the condoning of homosexuality is one of the great tragedies in our culture. In fact, it's particularly significant because it's symptomatic of the decay of the culture in general. It's used as a symptom of decaying cultures throughout history, in the biblical period, in the Roman period, and so on. And when you get the same Hebrew word here, to'abah, that's used for an abomination, it really it's called an abomination in the King James. It's called a detestable thing in the nearly inspired version, the NIV. But some people argue that the reason it's in there because this kind of thing was associated with pagan rites. Yeah, indeed it may have been, but that it goes deeper than that. This law deals with the divine order in creation that God is jealous of, and God detests any violation of that divine order. And so believers should, this word abomination, in Leviticus 28, verse 22, it's the same word. Thou shalt not lie with mankind as with womankind. It is an abomination. And in Leviticus 20:13, if a man lie with mankind as he lieth with a woman, both of them have committed an abomination. They shall surely be what? Put to death. Their blood shall be upon them. I can understand why the homosexual community is not particularly interested in becoming biblical. It would solve a lot of problems. So let's move on anyway. I think that speaks for itself. And don't misunderstand me, by the way. I think our president has expressed himself remarkably well. There was an occasion years ago when Jimmy Carter tried to express himself, I think with some sincerity, and it was quite an embarrassment to many because the way he held it, he wasn't wrong. He admitted to committing adultery in his heart and so forth, and the general audience could not handle the way he expressed it because he assumed more sophistication on his audience than exists. So Jimmy Carter, I think, bungled it. But I think George Bush did a good job. We are not to hate the homosexual. But at the same time, he argues that it's not appropriate for them to enforce their mores on society at large. And there's a big difference. But let's go. Now we got a bird's nest thing here. Changing the subject, getting to something a little more dealable. If a bird's nest chance to be before thee in the way in any tree or on the ground, whether they be young ones or eggs, and the dam sitting upon the young or upon the eggs, thou shalt not take the dam with the young. But thou shalt in any wise let the dam go, and let the young to thee, that it may be well with thee, that thou mayest prolong thy days. Now, why is this in the law? I mean, this sounds kind of trivial, doesn't it? And yet the idea is that the idea is to have reverence, perhaps for some people say, what's to have reverence for parental relationships. I think we should have reverence for parental relationships, but I don't think that's the issue here, really. Because, frankly, the reason I say that is because the Israelites were allowed to take the young ones and the eggs. I don't think that's a lesson to apply to families in any particular way. That's not the point. I think primarily what this is pointing to is for Israel to protect its food sources. Taking the young of the eggs is one thing, but let the dam go so that it can continue to be a resource. And so this is really, in a sense, a lesson in ecology. And so I don't think I would make more of it than that. So when thou buildest a new house, then thou shalt make a battlement for thy roof, that thou bring not blood upon thy house, if any man fall from thence. Now, if you read this casually without any law background, this may not mean a lot to you. What he's saying is when you build a new house, you shall make a battlement or a parapet for thy roof, that you bring not blood upon the house. What on earth is he talking about? Well, first of all, you need to understand the roof of a house in the Middle East was used for a lot of different purposes. It was like an open veranda for evening social purposes. And remember in Matthew 24, when Jesus is talking about the abomination of desolation and so forth, let he that's on the housetop not go down to get his coat. There's a whole concatenation of things where what he's saying is, when that happens, then let them which be in Judea, not in the world in general, in Judea. Why? Because that's going to occur at the temple. When those in Judea, you split now, is what he's saying. If you're in a field, don't go back to the house to get your coat. If you're on the housetop, don't go downstairs to get your coat. You get out of there. It's like now, and they're there to flee to Petra and all that. You can get that in our scenarios there. But the point is, the house in the Middle East, the roof, is a social gathering place. It's like an open veranda. The houses are usually on a hillside, and but it's the roof that's in the cool of the evening where there's a breeze. It's very typically the same way you and I would use like a backyard. But what he's saying, when you build a new house, make sure you have a parapet around there so someone won't have an accident, to keep blood from on thy house and man fall from thence. And this is to prevent an accident. Now, strangely enough, there is a rule in law, in civil law, called res ipsa loquitur. It's Latin for the thing speaks of itself. And in civil law, what this is, it's a rebuttable presumption that the defendant was negligent, which arises upon proof that instrumentality causing injury was in the defendant's exclusive control, and that the accident was one which ordinarily does not happen in the absence of negligence. One of the landmark cases was where a flower pot fell off a roof and hit somebody down there, and they sued, and it was held because it was negligence. It wouldn't have happened if somebody hadn't been negligent. It wasn't like it's not deliberate murder, of course, but it res ipsa loquitur. The thing speaks for itself. In other words, it's this is what really is an issue here, is that you have an obligation for diligence, because you have a basic presumption that of negligence if there's an injury where the instrumentality that caused that injury was in your exclusive control, and the accident was one that ordinarily would not happen in the absence of negligence. The flower pot would not have fallen if somebody had any brains not to have it on the wall on a 10-story building with somebody walking down there. That's sort of the model, if you will. And res ipsa loquitur is a thing it's a rebuttable presumption. I won't get into all that. Anyway, same kind of thing. The point of what this is really saying is, what the idea behind this is that you are accountable. If you have a swimming pool, you should have a fence around it so neighboring kids won't drown. It's that kind of thing. You're going to be held accountable. Now that can be carried too far, as it often is in a society, especially in terms of product liability and that sort of thing. But still, the whole issue hangs on the question of what diligence, where does diligence and negligence, where's the boundary? And so, anyway, let's move on. Verse 9, thou shalt not sow thy vineyard with divers seeds, lest the fruit of thy seed which thou hast sown and the fruit of thy vineyard be defiled. Thou shalt not plow with an ox and an ass together. Thou shalt not wear a garment of divers sorts, as of woolen and linen together. Well, you say, what's wrong with wool and linen? Try washing it. Because the wool will shrink and the linen won't. But anyway, that's not the real issue here, I don't think. I think the whole idea really is that I think these are primarily intended to be symbolic examples that, teaching the Israelites something of God's created order. And there may also be aspects of this that have to do with pagan cultic practices, but I don't think you get into that. God desires order, and I think that's one reason what's dealing here with, by implication, are mixed marriages too. I'm not talking interracial marriages, I'm talking believer, non-believer kind of things. That God warns against inappropriate mixtures. And the child of God cannot mix with the world. That's the real root issue here. I hear Christians say that, well, they go the way of the world in order to reach the people of the world. And that's not the way to reach them. If you find anyone reached that way, I'd love to hear about it. No, usually the world reaches the guy that way. And so be careful of that. Thou shalt make thee fringes upon the four quarters of thy vesture, wherewith thou coverest thyself. Now, this is not explained here, what's going on here, but the meaning is very clear. If you go to Numbers 15, they have tassels and so forth, and the tassels are there to remind them of the Lord's commands and Israel's obligation to obey them. Now, this has been formalized in Talmudic Judaism with the 613 knots on them, and there's 613 commands in the Torah, and they've made quite a thing of that. And I'm not here to support or disparage it. That's not the point. It is biblical that the fringes were intended to remind them of their obligations before the Lord. You and I aren't sensitive to this because we're not used to hems or fringes. You and I are used to seeing rank on sleeves, like on an airline pilot or on a naval officer. On the military side, you usually see them on the shoulder boards or on the collar, symbols of the rank. We see symbols of rank in different styling in our culture, but in the older culture, all of that was in the fringe of the garment, the hems. And the hems of the garment were their signature, their genealogy. That's why David, when he cut the hem of Saul's garment when he was sleeping, later repented of it because he was in effect invading on Saul's authority by the hem. In the old culture, you could divorce by ripping off the hem. You could press the hem into a clay tablet as a signature. The hem was a badge of authority, and that's one reason the woman with the issue of blood pushing through the crowd wanted simply to touch Christ's hem of his garment, because she felt that if she could touch that, she would receive the benefit of his authority. And that whole story. So the hems are important. And that's what happens in the book of Ruth too, where she asks Boaz to spread his skirt over her. That sounds weird to us because we don't understand what's going on. God says he spread his skirt over Israel, meaning he puts his covering over her. When a husband takes a wife, he spreads his covering over her. That was the concept. So these fringes here are symbolic, of course, but in this case, the fringes on their garment was to remind them of their obligations to obey God's laws. And in Numbers 15, we have them. They bid them that they make fringes in the borders of the garments, that ye may look upon it and remember all the commandments of the Lord and do them. So that's Moses is taking that for granted in the sermon here, that they're familiar with Numbers 15. Let's go to Deuteronomy 22, verse 13. If any man take a wife and go in unto her and hate her, and give occasions of speech against her, and bring up an evil name upon her, and say, I took this woman, and when I came to her, I found her not a maid, that is not a virgin. Then shall the father of the damsel and her mother take and bring forth the tokens of the damsel's virginity unto the elders of the city in the gate. I find it hard to visualize this proceeding, but I guess that, anyway, they bring the sheets to show that she really was a virgin, I guess. And the damsel's father shall say unto the elders, I gave my daughter unto this man to wife, and he hateth her. And lo, he hath given occasions of speech against her, saying, I found her not thy daughter a maid, and yet these are the tokens of my daughter's virginity, and they shall spread the cloth before the elders of the city. And the elders of the city shall take that man and chastise him, and they shall immerse him in 100 shekels of silver, and give them unto the father of the damsel, because he hath brought up an evil name upon a virgin of Israel, and she shall be his wife, and he may not put her away all his days. And so, if this thing be true, and the tokens of the virginity be not found for the damsel, and they shall bring out the damsel to the door of her father's house, and the men of her city shall stone her with stones that she die, because she hath wrought folly in Israel, to play the whore in her father's house, so shalt thou put evil away from among you. So they didn't mess around. So they took these things very seriously. And if a man be found lying with a woman married to a husband, then they shall both of them die, both the man that lay with the woman and the woman. and so shalt thou put away the evil from Israel. And I think we all remember the occasion when they wanted to put Christ on the spot. They brought the woman taken adultery later down there and to put him to a test. And of course, he handled that very skillfully by saying, let the first person without sin to cast the first stone. What's not obvious there until you start studying a little bit is they got the woman. Where's the man? She was caught in the very act, they said. Great, where's the guy? No, this was a setup. This was a setup. Of course, Jesus is not fooled. They realized that the whole thing's contrived to put him on the spot. So, we'll go on here anyway. If a damsel that is a virgin be betrothed unto a husband, and a man find her in the city and lie with her, then ye shall bring them both out unto the gate of the city, and ye shall stone them with stones that they die. The damsel because she cried not, being in the city, and the man because he hath humbled his neighbor's wife. So shalt thou put away evil from among you. This is a very strange thing, because on the one hand, yeah, okay, he has violated this virgin, but the concept of it's in the city, the presumption they're making is that she didn't cry out for help. So she is implicit in having given consent, is what the idea is, because they both end up dying. In contrast, if she's out in the field, they handle it differently. But if a man find a betrothed damsel in the field, and a man force her and lie with her. See, what they're, incidentally, I should explain, the betrothed damsel, even though the marriage isn't consummated, she's a virgin, but she's betrothed, it's the same as adultery, from their point of view. You follow me? That's what they're dealing with here. This isn't just the rape of a gal, that's bad enough. But this is one that's been betrothed, she's a virgin, so she's being, if it's in the city, she participates in the penalty. But if a man find a betrothed vessel in the field, and a man force her and lie with her, then the man only that lay with her shall die. The presumption is that being out in the field, no one would hear her if she did scream. Sounds bizarre, but that's anyway. But unto the damsel thou shalt do nothing. There is in the damsel no sin worthy of death. For as when a man rises up against his neighbor and slayeth him, even so is this matter. For he found her in the field, and the betrothed damsel cried, and there was none to save her. So that gives her, in a sense, a protection from death, you see. If a man find a damsel that is a virgin, which is not betrothed, and lay hold on her and lie with her, and they be found, then the man that lay with her shall give unto the damsel's father 50 shekels of silver, and she shall be his wife, because he hath humbled her. He may not put her away all his days. There were provisions for divorce that would not apply here. So, a man shall not take his father's wife, nor uncover really, his father's skirt. And so this doesn't, strangely enough, this may not refer to adultery in the traditional sense. This may really be dealing with those that, a man marrying his stepmother after his father died. That would have been regarded as incestuous, according to Leviticus 18:8. So there's more to it than just saying here. So there we are. Okay. We finished a little early, but let me just append some thoughts. Some of these things may seem very foreign to us because of the tribal nature and the nature of that culture. So we obviously don't go out and stone the sin of adultery. On the one hand, that would certainly reduce the traffic problems on our freeways, but it would probably make the rock piles would make our cities look like a war zone. And we joke about it in a sense, but let's talk a little bit about what this has all been talking about here, our broken families. And it's the most basic form of society, the basic molecule of society is the family. And the family is the seedbed for any virtues. Whatever virtues we may have are bred in the seedbed of our family. And our national policies, of course, contribute to family instability and breakup. You know, as a systems engineer, I never understood this until I modeled it. Causing family instability leads to adultery, promiscuity, all kinds of social sins. These social sins create social problems that have to be dealt with. That gives governments excuses to create bureaus and stuff for welfare, what have you, because of all these abuses. And so the more they can promote this kind of misbehavior, the more it creates the need for bigger government. And I suddenly realized something a lot of this may not be that conscious, but I realize that the whole thing is self-perpetuating, because the more you can destabilize a society, the more excuse you have for the government to get control and get involved. We live in the first generation in our nation's history in which to do worse psychologically, socially, economically than the parents. The widespread presumption among the informed people is that our children will have a tough time doing as well as we did, economically, socially, in terms of, for lots of different reasons. It's always been a case where you always hope that your kids would have it better than you did. But we live in a society where it's not likely because of the debris that we call our national policies. And heterosexuals reproduce, but homosexuals recruit. So that's one of the root problems we've got. And the post-war generation that the older ones of us grew up in, we grew up, 80% of the post-war generation grew up in a family with two biological parents who were married to each other. We took that for granted. By 1980, less than 50% expect to spend their entire childhood with an intact family. Less than half. An increasing number of children will experience family breakup 2 or even 3 times during childhood. That is the norm in our culture. There's empirical evidence that demonstrates that children in disrupted families do worse than those in intact families. All this nonsense that of people getting divorced, that, well, the kids are going to do all right, they're resilient, has been disproven by empirical evidence. In disrupted families, the children are 6 times more likely to end up poor. 22% of one-parent families will experience poverty during childhood for 7 years or more versus 2% of children in two-parent families. And children of single-parent families were 3 times as likely to have emotional and behavioral problems. They're more likely to drop out of high school. They're more likely to get pregnant as teenagers. They're more likely to abuse drugs. They're more likely to be trouble with the law. They're also higher risk for physical or sexual abuse. They're less likely to be successful as adults, especially in love and in work. They have a tough time achieving intimacy when they grow up in a relationship, forming a stable marriage, or even holding a steady job. And that's from the National Center of Health Statistics. Teen suicide rate has tripled, juvenile crime has increased and become more violent, school performance has continued to decline. Welfare dependency tends to be passed on from one generation to the next. The government has, in effect, an incentive to increase these social problems because that increases welfare dependency. And if you really get interested in this and want to get some, check out Star Parker, a gal that just one of the most phenomenal personalities I've ever had the pleasure of meeting at the Council for National Policy. A gal that shook off the welfare trap that she was in with her children. She has become a national figure. She's there with all the facts and figures. She's changed. That she has a major impact on our national policy. Maybe not enough to fix it all, but she's an incredible resource for all this sort of thing. The roots of family instability. 33% of children born in America today are illegitimate. 1 out of 3. 22% white, 22% white, 65% black births. 10% of live births are exposed to illegal drugs in the womb. 70% of juvenile crimes grew up in single-parent or no-parent families. 70%. Each day in America, there are virtually 2,800 teen pregnancies per day. Over 1,100 teen abortions per day. 4,000 teenagers contract a sexually transmitted disease per day in America. Every 64 seconds, a baby is born to a teenage mother. 5 minutes later, a baby will have born to a teenager who already has a child. And 10 hours later, 560 babies will have been born to teenagers. Daughters of single parents are 53% more likely to marry as teenagers, 111% more likely to have children as teenagers, 164% more likely to have a premarital birth, 92% more likely to dissolve their own marriages. Every divorce, as the Jews like to say, is the death of a small civilization. It inflicts wounds that never heal. survey after survey demonstrates that Americans are less inclined than they were a generation ago to value sexual fidelity, lifelong marriage, and parenthood as worthwhile personal goals. Fewer than half of all adult Americans today regard the idea of sacrifice for others as a positive moral value. The adult quest for freedom, independence, and choice in family relationships conflicts with a child's developmental needs for stability, constancy, harmony, and permanence in family life. It's interesting how Jesus warned us that the love of many will grow cold. And the word love there, by the way, is agape. The agape of many will grow cold as an end time indicator. So ends our session for today. I'm not optimistic that through national action, be it through the Council for National Policy or whatever else, that we'll have I think it's worth fighting on the one hand. On the other hand, I'm not optimistic. I think we're in a period of decay. And if the studies are correct, that we are destined for the end of our nation. There have been a number of classic studies of how nations die. They all come to the same conclusion, pretty much, that we go from bondage to spiritual faith, from spiritual faith to liberty, from liberty to abundance, from abundance to complacency, from complacency to apathy, from apathy to dependence, and from dependence back into bondage. And that cycle takes about 200 years, typically 2 centuries, throughout history. And we may be overdue for that cycle. And there's only one place I've seen it, that cycle broken. And that was the capital of Assyria, a place called Nineveh, that had ruled the world for centuries. God sent Jonah with a message. And he was not excited about the project, you may recall, until God explained it to him a little more clearly. And when he went there to Nineveh, he didn't go with the right attitude. He didn't preach what they should do. He just announced their doom. He went through town saying, 40 days and you get yours. And in effect. And he was hoping that God would wipe them out because he was a patriot for his own country. He knew they were the enemies. But God told him to do that, and he went there. And the most astonishing miracle in the Old Testament was not the fish and all that business, was the repentance of Nineveh. Because they were 40 days from ground zero, and within those 40 days, the king of Nineveh, on spec, repented. Jonah didn't tell him to. There's no evidence of that. He just said, 40 days comes destruction. And the king not only believed it, he reasoned that just maybe, if they repent, God just might spare them. He was on spec. And he did. The king put on sackcloth and ashes, and the town conformed to that, and judgment was averted. Of course, to show Jonah's heart, he went and pouted. He didn't want that to happen. But because they repented, they got a whole another 100 years. And I think Robert Bork's book, Slouching Towards Gomorrah, is correct. The only thing that will save America is a grassroots revival. And so if you care about your children and grandchildren, you care about this country, it's time to pray. And we need a revival, and it needs to begin with us. Because in 2 Chronicles 7:14, God announces a principle to Solomon that I think we can claim. It says, if my people are called by my name, I think all of us would raise our hands. We're God's people, called by his name. If my people are called by my name, will humble themselves and pray and seek my face and turn from their wicked ways, then will I hear from heaven, forgive their sin and heal the land. Well, we know how to humble ourselves. We may not do enough of it, but we know how to do that. Humble themselves and pray. If my people are called by my name, will humble themselves and pray and seek my face. Well, we know how to humble ourselves. We know how to pray. Seeking his face is something a little more deeper. That's a passion thing. That's a commitment thing. But here's the kicker. It says, if my people are called by my name, will humble themselves and pray and seek my face and turn from their wicked ways. It's not the wicked ways of the pagan left that are in the corridors of power that are a problem. It's not the Congress, not the Senate, not the Democrats. Well, anyway. Republicans are no better. They're just more disorganized. The problem is the body of Christ. It's not the sin of the Congress or the pagan left or the liberal news media. No. If my people who are called by my name will humble themselves and pray and seek my face and turn from their wicked ways, then will I hear from heaven and forgive their sin and heal their land. And so it's the sin in the body of Christ that's in God's way, what God would prefer. I believe God would prefer that America remain a beachhead for the gospel to a hurting world. What stands in the way is us. It's our sin. It's our complacency. It's our failure to obey his commands that are encumbering the future of this country. I had a wonderful conversation some time ago with Joe DeCourcy, whose family has published the Intelligence Digest for a couple generations. Really brilliantly, strategically informed human beings on the planet Earth. He said, Chuck, we're going to look back on the 50s and 60s as the golden era of personal freedom on the planet Earth. We're going to look back and realize how good we had it, because it's over. We're moving, because of terrorism and other excuses, we're moving into a time of a great jeopardy. But it is what it is, and God is in the throne. But I think we need to, if we're serious about our children's future and this country, we need to spend some time in prayer and get serious about it. Pray for a revival. And in that spirit, let's stand for a closing prayer.